You know, there's many things that we all have in common, and one thing we can say that if we're here today, that your heart is beating. We share that in common. That if we are here today, our lungs are breathing. And that if we're here today, our mind is alert, at least somewhat. We could say that if we're here, that we are living life right here. But perhaps a more useful way for us to look at this is for us to turn it around and to realize that life is living us. That right now, life, the greater life, is beating our heart. You know, doctors, scientists, they still cannot figure out. They can literally temporarily stop a human heart, put it into another body, and restart it with an electrical charge, but they don't know what is that behind it which ultimately makes it beat. We plant things into the earth and we watch it grow, but we don't really understand what is it within the earth that ultimately makes it grow. Well, that all of life, we can say, is being lived by a greater life. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I want to begin by showing you three different texts that really talk about our purpose here on earth. Would you give me the first slide? This one says, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" You see that our goal in life is to bring it to the surface. Just like this beautiful instrument that he's playing, it has, or the piano, all of these instruments have the capacity to bring forth something, but something is required in order to bring it forth. So it is with our life. The next scripture, which comes from 1 Peter, says it slightly differently. You are living stones that God is building into God's spiritual temple. What's more, you are God's holy mediators. And then the next one, I like the way the Sufi poet Rumi says it. No particle can grow to seedling from anything but the whole. You are of the whole. So for me, then, the question becomes, to what extent am I consciously being the spiritual temple? To what extent am I being this holy messenger or mediator? To what extent am I being a conduit of light and love? That we are literally here to be an embodiment, to embody the characteristics of peace, of love, of light, that we are here to be that divine channel, that vessel, that conduit. And so we ask ourselves, to what extent are we doing this? So this spring, I'm creating a series that are based on what I'm calling it's the 7 centers of our sacred light, our sacred being. How many of you are familiar with the term chakra? Your chakras, pretty much everybody, I think, are familiar. How many of you have had your chakras balanced or read? Or you read about your chakras? Or you know nothing about your chakras. You just learned a word and you'll go home and Google it. It's a Sanskrit word that basically means spinning wheel or a wheel of energy. And if you go back last week and look, our talks are online, I actually showed scriptures where in the Bible it talks about these centers of light within us. And people throughout the ages, mention of the chakras are actually found in some of the oldest sacred texts, the Hindu Upanishads. And so you can learn about the different ways people explain it, such as there's light, but then light is reflected into many rays so that we can enjoy the vastness of it. We are spiritual beings, but the question becomes, so what? It doesn't really mean anything until we can anchor it on earth in practical ways. And we do things, we create things, how we see, how we perceive what we know. And so last week we talked about our foundational chakra called the root chakra, which is our I am, that I belong here. Remember, we talked about I belong here for heaven's sake, that there's a higher purpose to our being here, and feeling that sense of worthiness and security that we feel we know we're supposed to be here. Well, today, as the energy begins to rise, we go up to the second chakra, which physically is located about 2 inches below your belly button. If you were to try to think about where that energy center exists, it's called the sacral chakra, and it's referred to as the chakra of pleasure and pain, of passion and desire. And some people may say, passion and desire, I didn't know that was spiritual. Well, now you know. It is. It's about spiritualizing all of life. And in children, it's interesting because what desire does and what desire is, it's the creative impulse that calls life out to grow, to express. In children, there's a sequential unfolding physically, how we grow from an infant and we begin to reach out. When children are born, they do not have, the visual system is not yet fully developed. Our visual system is one of our systems which completes development after birth. When a child is born, their vision is basically, at best, 2200, and the range is 2200 to 2800. That tells you the kind of vision that little infants have. By the time a child is 4 months old, their vision is around 2060. By the time they're right about 6 months, it locks in typically at 2020. And with children around 6 months, that's when they begin reaching. It's like their whole world now opens up and they start crawling and reaching and they want to explore because this natural impetus within us is calling life out. Every spring we see life, the sap rises, life is being called out to explore and experience itself. Well, Eric and Terry, would you come join me? I wanted to set this up talking about desire. There's a wonderful reading that I love, which comes from, of all places, Zorba the Greek. Nikos Kazanakis wrote this, and to me it is a beautiful depiction of the creative process and how life is always calling us out. Listen to this. Richard, would you give us some beautiful Zorba the Greek music? Blowing in heaven and earth, and in our hearts and in the hearts of every living thing, is a gigantic breath, a great cry, which we call God. Plant life wished to continue its motionless sleep next to stagnant waters, but the cry leaped up within it and violently shook its roots.
Away! Let go of the earth. Walk.
Had the tree been able to judge, the tree would have cried out,
I don't want to. What are you urging me to do? You're demanding the impossible.
but the cry without pity kept shaking its roots and shouting,
Away! Let go of the earth. Walk.
The cry shouted for thousands of eons, and lo, as a result of desire and struggle, life escaped the motionless tree and was liberated. Animals appeared, worms, making themselves at home in the earth and the mud.
We're just fine.
They said,
We have peace and security. We're not budging.
but the terrible cry hammered itself pitilessly into their loins.
Leave the mud. Stand up. Give birth to your betters. Give birth to your betters. Give birth to your betters.
We don't want to. We can't.
You can't, but I can. Stand up.
And lo, after thousands of eons, man emerged, trembling on his still, unsolid legs. The human being is a center. His equine hoofs are planted in the ground, but his body from breast to head is worked on and tormented by this merciless cry. He's been fighting again for thousands of eons to draw himself like a sword out of his animalistic scabbard. He is also fighting in this new struggle to draw himself out of his human scabbard. Man calls out in despair.
Where can I go? I've reached the pinnacle. Beyond is the abyss.
But the cry answers,
I am beyond. Stand up.
would you give them a hand? I am beyond. Stand up. Can you relate to feeling this internal cry within your being? Something that is impelling you from within? Sometimes it feels like a cry, but most of the times it feels like recognizable desire. That desire is driving you just out and beyond who you know yourself to be. I remember about 10 years ago, my prayer partner and just a wonderful individual who will be here next week, she's facilitating our prayer chaplain training. She takes spiritual groups around the world on these spiritual adventures. And she thought she wanted to go to Mexico. And so before she takes a group, she goes by herself to explore it and to see if there are worthy things. So she asked me if I'd like to go with her to Mexico. And I can't explain why, but something inside of me, this cry just said, yes, you must go. So I visualized myself lying on the beaches and just enjoying myself. And I said, sure, I'll go with you to Mexico. Something inside of me, I just knew, wanted me to go to Mexico. And I was loving it. And I was loving walking around, looking at the pyramids until she said, oh, no, we must climb these. Well, I have had a fear of heights. Has anyone climbed Chichen Itza? Anybody climbed one of these? It's not like they have these handrails and make it easy for you. These things are primitive. And I said, no way, I'll stay down here. But something inside said, you must do this. And so on wobbly legs, I went up. And people in walkers passed me. People with canes passed me. It was pitiful how long it took. When I finally got to the top, my friend was just like, oh, isn't this beautiful? And I'm like, don't touch me. I was trembling all over. And I finally sat down. And I'm the person that slid down Chichen Itza like this. People on canes. You'll be all right, honey. Just keep going. And then it wasn't enough. She said, let's rappel off this mountain backwards. I'm like, people do this stuff for fun. And let's go into a cenote. Let's go into a cave underwater where it's pitch dark and swim. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Like, are you kidding me? I did it all. And I learned about myself. There was something in me impelling me to go. And you see, it took me beyond my own comfort zone, to say the least. Things that I thought I would never do, I could never do, it took me beyond that. It helped shake out some of my pride. If you ever slide down your rear end down a whole pyramid, it just does something to your pride. It loosened me up in ways that I didn't even know I needed to be loosened up, and I didn't know I could be loosened up. That's what desire is about. Desire is this incredible creative impulse. And sometimes people misunderstand the teachings around desire, especially if you're in Western Buddhism. You will begin to think, oh, but desire is bad. Buddhism does not teach that. Buddhism talks about bringing mindfulness to our desires. That can we be present to the struggle and the opportunity that our desires bring? Because you see, the whole point is, who are we becoming in the process? That we're being called out of ourselves every single day. That if you are here with a heartbeat, with your lungs breathing, with skin on, you are here to bring forth more. And that's the beauty of desire. And so as this chakra begins to awaken, we have to learn what it is to feel desire and impulses, and how not to be carried away by them, how not to shut them down, but how to be in relationship with our desires. And so we begin by realizing that desire is central to human life, that I think we could more accurately be called human desirelings rather than human beings, because we are true beings of desire. And that it's inconceivable to consider human life without desire. That our basic operating system as humans has desire deeply embedded into it, consciously and unconsciously, that some of our most innate desires to eat, to procreate, these are things that keep the human race alive and moving forward, that desire is a part of our very nature. The point is, can we be present to the opportunities and the challenges that they bring? And so some of the questions that we ask ourselves are, what is this desire telling me about myself? What is the desire pointing out? You see, sometimes a desire will point out our wholeness and our authentic desire to explore. Sometimes a desire will point out a way that we're holding ourselves back. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. What is the desire seeking to bring out? Is the desire bringing out my life, my light, and more of my authentic divine essence? Or is this desire keeping me small? Is it obscuring my life? Is it destructing? Is it self-destructive? Is the desire leading me into my wholeness, or is the desire leading me into separation? There's a story that comes from Zen Buddhism about desire. The story is about an abbess, a woman who had this great monastery. And individuals would come who were struggling with life. They'd come to learn how to meditate and learn the ways of Buddhism so they could go back into everyday life and really be present and be free and be liberated. And so upon arriving, she would help have them build a little thatch hut where they would live and they'd learn to meditate. And then at a certain point in time, a test would come. And as the story goes, there's the first man who had built his hut, and he'd been there about a year, really studying and really practicing. But what his challenge was just gluttony and addiction, that the man really struggled with, just being excessive, eating too much, drinking too much. His life was out of control. So one night he comes back to the tent, and it's filled with food, with wine, with everything. So the next day the abbess comes and checks on him, and the man is passed out on the floor. He really indulged. She wakes him up, has him go outside, burns the hut down, and says, "You'll get to start over." The second man, his temptation was just unbridled lust. And so he comes back to his tent one night, and there's a beautiful woman in his tent. The next day, the abbess comes back, and the woman's not there, and he said, "Tell me about your night." And he said, "I was here alone." And she said, "What about the young woman?" And he said, I didn't see her. I sent her out immediately. I wouldn't even entertain the thought. He said, "Come outside." And she burned his hut down and said, "You can build another hut and practice for another year." He went to the third man. His challenge was money and greed that he had struggled with. So when he went in his hut, there were jewels and money. There were lottery tickets. There were tickets to the casino. There were everything you could imagine. And the next day she goes in to see this man, and he's sitting in a chair with all of this stuff around him drinking tea. And she asked, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I am learning to be with my desire. I'm paying attention to my desires. I'm having tea with my desires." And she invited him outside and said, "You're welcome to go back into the world. You have now learned how to dance with your desires." And what Buddhism says about this is spiritual awakening is not synonymous with the cessation of desire, emotional shutdown, or icy withdrawal. We deny our needs at our own peril. There is no escaping life in the longings that are hinged to it. If we try to extinguish or transcend human desires and passions, they simmer underground, where they grow into a firestorm that destroys us. This doesn't mean that we should act upon every desire, but rather to acknowledge them and engage with them in a skillful way. Such was he doing, that he was hanging out with the objects of his desire to understand what they were to him. And that's the relationship that we're all seeking to have with our desires, to not let every desire literally cause us to just forget who we are, what's important to us, and be swept off our feet. Nor is it to reach a point on the opposite end of the spectrum, to suppress and deny. And in our Western culture, can you see where we have excesses in both areas? That there is a lot of religion was about suppressing desires. Look at, well, I won't name any churches, but a lot of religions were about suppressing desires. And then you have, flower children and all sorts of things. We always have the pendulum swing back and forth, but it's about finding your way and being attuned to your desire. The great meditation teacher Jack Kornfield, many of you probably know him, when he went to Asia and studied for many years and he came back, what he realized was he said that he was an emotional infant and a sexual idiot, is the way he described himself. He said he was a very enlightened man, but that didn't grow up all the other parts of himself. But he said the gift that his ability to meditate gave him was a very painful gift, because what it taught him was how to bring awareness to where was he acting out emotionally, where was he not behaving in a way that he truly felt honoring of himself and others when it came to all areas of his life. That life is seeking for us to grow up and grow out, that we can bring forth our gifts in many different directions. And so that's what it means to really learn to be in our relationship with our desire. And so desire is then a catalyst for self-discovery and for self-expression. And so we ask ourselves, is this desire leading me into my wholeness, or is it somehow leading me to surface? Remember, I told you last week that when we look at the 7 chakras, that in the book of Revelation, there's the number 7 is used multiple times, but in particular, there's 7 seals and 7 churches. These 7 churches are linked to the chakras. The second church is called the Church of Smyrna. Myrrh, coming from the remember myrrh, when the I started to say the disciples, when the wise men brought to baby Jesus, remember it was frankincense, gold, and myrrh. That myrrh is considered a very valuable property that has properties of life and death. Myrrh is known as being both bitter and sweet, and it's like coffee. It has to be crushed to really gain the essence of it. But what this particular church was known as the suffering-rich church, because the message for that particular church was, I know your works, there's been tribulation, there's been poverty, but you are rich. You see, it's about, you can stay at the surface of life, or we can go deeper, and our desires will always take us in one of those directions. And so how we are in relationship to our desires, how we're holding our desires, and the biggest thing that you can ask yourself is, what is the intention behind the desire? For example, when we ask, what is the intention behind the desire? You may have a neighbor that is not doing well, and you have a desire to go take some soup to help out. And so you may ask yourself, what is the intention behind the desire? Well, you may realize there's compassion. That may be me. What if it were me? Or you may go deeper and say, well, the reason I really want to help is because I'm afraid if I don't, I'll be judged. Now, can you see that just the desire to help someone doesn't really tell you a lot about yourself, but going deeper, is this desire coming out of compassion? Is it coming out of because I don't think I measure up in some way? I think something is missing. You may have a desire to go shopping. You have a desire to go shopping, and you may ask yourself, what is the intention behind this desire? Well, the intention behind the desire is my children need new school clothes. I want my children, I love them. I want them to have what they need. And that desire, again, leads you to compassion and care. But you may have a desire to go shopping, and you ask yourself, what's behind my desire to go shopping? And you may realize, I feel lonely. I don't want to be present to my loneliness. I feel empty. I don't want to sit in my restlessness, in my emptiness. And so desire will always help us realize, who are we in the process? Is this desire helping me release and do something that flows from compassion, from goodness, from love, from wholeness? Is it helping me learn something new about myself to transcend my boundaries? Or is this desire born out of, would you give me the next slide? These are the ways that we know if the desire is driven by compulsion, if the desire is driven by a need to compensate, if it's driven in a way where we're controlling or clinging, if there's comfort or distraction or denial, if they're seeking to suppress something, and most certainly if it causes harm to others or to ourselves, then we realize that these desires are not taking us beyond our own suffering, that we must go deeper to discover our inner riches. And so simply asking ourselves, what is the intention behind our desire, will truly be a help to us. There's a true story about a little boy. Would you give me that song, Richard? His name is Fitzroy McLean. When Fitzroy was a little boy, his father took him to the ruins of a castle. Fitzroy was from Scotland. And as a little boy, when his father took him to the ruins of this castle, his father explained that this castle used to belong to our ancestors. That many years ago it was functioning. And the little boy was intrigued by it, but something inside of him just leapt up, sort of like that inside of me that said, you must go to Mexico. Thinking it was one thing and realizing it's something else. But in this little boy, Fitzroy said that he put his hands on some of the stones and his hand on his heart, and he said, I vow to rebuild this castle. That it totally drove him. And over the years, carrying that desire and being in relationship with that desire, it grew him. That it seemed to flavor everything that he did. That his life was directed to that. But from the outside, you couldn't really see it. Well, when he was 76 years old, he finally had the resources to begin to rebuild the castle. At 76. It took him 24 years to rebuild the castle. If you're doing the math, he was 100 years old. He planted a tree, people had been watching, and the people had really come to admire this man and see so many qualities in him that they admired. Well, in that particular area, there had been a feud that had been going on for 187 years between the McClans and another clan. And this other clan wrote into him as he finished this castle, my clansmen, I hope you will bear in mind that we must this day bury the hatchet. I have the kindest letters from those who formerly were our enemies and who I may now say are our greatest friends. A feud that had been going on for 187 years was ended, and a man at the age of 100 years old opened a castle that stands today in Scotland. He lived incidentally another 18 months after that. And the people around him said that because of that desire, he lived a long, rich life. Because of that desire, he was able to become someone in the process of the realization of that desire. What our soul wants us to know is that we have imbued within us a desire to realize and release our potential. That our soul has a desire to realize and release and express ourselves as God on earth, as the expression of God, just like the scripture said, that we are the temple of God, that we are the living building stones. And every other healthy desire is really a window to cultivate skills and talents and abilities, to trespass our own self-imposed boundaries that we may do this. There are the desires that will burn you, that will bring you down. The joy is bringing awareness to them and entering into our relationship in such a way that it's a beautiful dance, that every desire can be used to take you back to yourself. And so we want to anchor this in a time of meditation, and to do so, we're going to use this song titled Breathe. Would you join me in? Would you give me the words? I breathe in, I breathe out, I take in, I give out, I let love, I let go, I release, and I know